1960, Bumpy Johnson earned $1 million every single day. The FBI spent 15 years trying to figure out how. They never did. This isn't just about money. This is about the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history. A system so perfect that federal agents couldn't even understand what they were looking at, let alone stop it. When they finally arrested Bumpy in 1963, they seized his records. What they found would rewrite everything they thought they knew about organized crime, and what they didn't find would haunt them for decades. This is the story of an economic genius who built an empire that made the Italian mob look like amateur hour. To understand how Bumpy Johnson created $1 million a day operation, you need to understand what Harlem was like in 19... This wasn't just another neighborhood. It was an economic powerhouse with over 400,000 residents and zero legitimate ways to build wealth. Banks wouldn't lend to black businesses. Insurance companies wouldn't cover black properties. Wall Street wouldn't hire black professionals. The entire legitimate economy was designed to keep Harlem's money flowing downtown to white-owned businesses. But Bumpy Johnson saw something that economists and politicians missed. All that excluded money had to go somewhere, and if the legitimate economy wouldn't serve Harlem, then the illegitimate economy would. By 1960, Bumpy had built what business schools would later call vertical integration and horizontal diversification, but he'd done it 15 years before those terms existed in MBA programs. The foundation of Bumpy's empire was the numbers racket, but not the simple illegal lottery that most people understood. Bumpy had systematized, automated, and revolutionized the entire operation into something resembling a modern financial services company. Every morning at 6 a.m., 500 runners collected bets from 50,000 customers across Harlem. Each runner covered a specific route of exactly 100 households. Each customer could bet between 5 cents and $50 on any three-digit number from 00 to 999. The winning number was determined by the last 3 digits of the New York Stock Exchange's daily trading volume, published in every newspaper. This meant the game was completely honest. No one could manipulate the outcome, not even Bumpy. But here's where Bumpy's genius showed. The mathematical odds of winning were 1,000 to 1, but he only paid 600 to 1. That 400 number difference generated a guaranteed 40% profit margin on every single bet. With 50,000 customers betting an average of $20 per day, Bumpy's numbers operation alone brought in $100,000 daily, pure profit, $40,000 per day. That's $280,000 per week, over $14 million per year in 1960 dollars. But the numbers racket was just the beginning. Bumpy had identified something that legitimate businesses were missing. Harlem residents needed financial services that the regular banking system wouldn't provide, so he created his own banking system. The Harlem Savings and Loan wasn't a real bank, but it functioned like one. Customers could deposit money and earn 12% annual interest, 4 times what downtown banks offered. They could take out loans at 20% interest, with no credit checks, no paperwork, and no racial discrimination. The loan business was particularly brilliant. Bumpy would lend money to anyone with a job, using their weekly paycheck as collateral. If someone borrowed $100, they paid back $20 per week for 6 weeks. That's $120 returned on a $100 loan, a 20% profit in 6 weeks. With 2,000 active loans averaging $250 each, the banking operation had $500,000 constantly circulating, weekly profits $50,000, annual profits $2.6 million. But Bumpy realized that lending money to individuals was small thinking. The real opportunity was lending money to businesses. Every legitimate business in Harlem needed capital to grow, but downtown banks wouldn't lend to them. Bumpy would. At 30% annual interest, he financed restaurants, beauty salons, clothing stores, and jazz clubs throughout the neighborhood. More importantly, every business that borrowed from Bumpy became part of his economic network. They gave jobs to people he recommended. They bought supplies from vendors he suggested. They deposited their cash in his informal banking system. By 1960, Over 300 Harlem businesses were part of Bumpy's network. Weekly profits from business lending, $75,000. Annual profits, $3.9 million. And then there was the real estate operation. Bumpy had noticed something that everyone else missed. Harlem property was dramatically undervalued because banks wouldn't provide mortgages to black buyers. Buildings worth $100,000 were selling for $30,000 because only cash buyers could purchase them. Bumpy became the cash buyer. Between 1955 and 1960, he purchased 127 properties throughout Harlem, apartment buildings, commercial spaces, vacant lots, anything with development potential. He paid cash, usually 50–70% below market value. But instead of keeping the properties, he sold them back to local residents using owner financing. A building he bought for $30,000, he'd sell for $80,000 with a $5,000 down payment and monthly payments of $500 for 20 years. The monthly payments alone brought in over $60,000 per month from his real estate portfolio. Annual profits, $720,000. But the real genius was what happened next. Many of the people buying properties from Bumpy couldn't make their monthly payments without additional income, so Bumpy would hire them to work in his other operations: numbers running, loan collection, business management. This created a closed economic loop where money circulated entirely within Harlem, creating jobs and building wealth for the community while generating massive profits for Bumpy's organization. The FBI would later estimate that by 1960, Bumpy Johnson controlled or influenced 85% of Harlem's economy. Over 10,000 people worked for him directly or indirectly. His daily gross income exceeded $1 million. But the most impressive part of Bumpy's empire wasn't how much money it made. It was how it operated without anyone being able to prove what it was. On paper, Bumpy Johnson was unemployed. He had no bank accounts, owned no property, held no business licenses. Officially, he didn't exist in the American economy, but his organization employed more people than most Fortune 500 companies. It provided more financial services than most banks. It owned more real estate than most development companies. How did he hide $1 million a day operation from federal investigators? The answer was something business schools would later call distributed management and compartmentalized operations. But Bumpy had invented it in the 1950s. No single person in Bumpy's organization understood more than their specific piece of the operation. Numbers runners knew their routes, but didn't know how many other runners existed. Loan officers knew their customers, but didn't know the total amount being lent. Property managers knew their buildings, but didn't know how many properties Bumpy owned. Financial records were kept in code, distributed across dozens of locations, and changed monthly. The FBI would find parts of the system, but never the whole picture. Communication was handled through a network of barbers, bartenders, and shopkeepers who passed messages without understanding what they meant. Orders came through indirect channels that couldn't be traced back to Bumpy. Most brilliantly, Bumpy never touched money directly. Cash flowed through dozens of intermediaries before reaching accounts controlled by legitimate businesses. By the time money reached Bumpy, it had been laundered through so many transactions that its illegal origin was untraceable. The result was an organization that generated massive profits while being virtually invisible to law enforcement. FBI agent Robert Kennedy, who led the investigation into Bumpy's operation from 1958 to 1963, would later write, "We knew Bumpy Johnson was running the most sophisticated criminal enterprise we'd ever encountered. We could see the effects, the money, the influence, the organization, but we could never see the machine itself." In 1961, the FBI assembled a task force of 50 agents specifically to investigate Bumpy's operation. They used wiretaps, informants, financial analysis, and surveillance. For 2 years, they documented every aspect of his organization they could find. Their final report was 3,000 pages long and concluded, "Subject operates a criminal enterprise of unprecedented complexity and profitability. Despite extensive investigation, the exact structure and methodology of the organization remains unknown." The FBI had documented $1 million-a-day criminal operation, but couldn't figure out how it worked. When Bumpy was finally arrested in 1963, it wasn't for his financial empire. It was for a single narcotics charge that carried a 15-year sentence. The feds couldn't prove the economic crimes, so they settled for whatever they could get. But even after Bumpy went to prison, his organization continued operating. The systems he'd created were so sophisticated that they ran themselves. Money kept flowing, loans kept being made, properties kept being developed. It took federal investigators another 5 years to dismantle what Bumpy had built. And even then, they never fully understood how it had worked. The economic principles that Bumpy Johnson pioneered in 1960s Harlem, community banking, alternative financing, local investment, circular economics, are now taught in business schools as cutting-edge strategies for developing underserved markets. Major corporations pay millions of dollars to consultants who teach them how to create the kind of integrated economic systems that Bumpy invented 50 years ago. The difference is that modern businesses are trying to extract wealth from communities. Bumpy was trying to build wealth within the community. His million-dollar-a-day operation wasn't just profitable for him. It created jobs for thousands of people, provided capital for hundreds of businesses, and generated wealth that stayed in Harlem instead of flowing to downtown banks. When economists today talk about community development and local economic empowerment, they're describing strategies that Bumpy Johnson perfected in the 1960s. The FBI spent 15 years trying to understand an organization that was decades ahead of its time. They were looking for a traditional criminal enterprise and found something that resembled a modern financial services company. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bumpy's economic empire was its resilience. Even after his arrest, even after years of federal investigation, the core principles he'd established continued to influence Harlem's economy for decades. Local businesses that had been part of his network continued to support each other. Community members who had learned financial literacy through his banking system continued to build wealth through legitimate means. Properties he had developed continued to provide affordable housing and commercial space for local entrepreneurs. In many ways, Bumpy Johnson had created more than just a criminal organization. He had created an economic infrastructure that outlasted his imprisonment and continued to benefit the community long after his death. Modern economists who study his methods are struck by their similarity to current theories about sustainable economic development. Community-controlled banking, local investment circles, cooperative business networks, all strategies that Bumpy pioneered in the 1950s and 1960s. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster who made money. He was an economic visionary who created a system that could have revolutionized how underserved communities build wealth. The tragedy is that his methods were illegal, so his innovations died with his imprisonment. But the principles he proved, that excluded communities can create their own economic systems, that local investment generates more wealth than external extraction, those principles remain as relevant today as they were in 19... This is the story of the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history, not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most intelligent. Bumpy Johnson proved that the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a threat, it's an economic system that serves its community. If this story of financial genius and economic innovation inspired you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that the most effective revolutions happen in spreadsheets, not in streets. And in the comments, let me know, could Bumpy's economic model work in today's legitimate business world? Next week, we're revealing the classified FBI files on this investigation that agents tried to keep secret for 60 years. You won't want to miss that.